Yeah, there's a little joke in the office where they mention, interning, right? You get your job. The key to interning is you keep showing up, and eventually they'll have to pay you. So that's what I did. But yeah, welcome to the lecture. Today we'll be talking about the Dey Mansion, headquarters and a home, experiences of the American Revolution. This is kind of a slideshow that I've been developing over the past couple of years, doing other presentations to other sites. And I think I've finally got it to where I like it, where I get to talk about the things I like talking about. And I hope some of this will be new information. I know one or two of you in here are familiar with the site, have been here before, so that's awesome. You'll have to come back when we reopen and it'll look all new. New exhibits inside, but we can talk about that later. So Dey Mansion, what is it? This is probably the most pertinent question to establish our background and setting. It's Washington's headquarters, one of many. Now, Washington would spend 3 months here in the year of 1780, and we'll talk more about the timeline and how that all connects a little bit later. But Washington's here for 3 months. He's here for three, what I would call campaigning months, during the months of July, October, and November, months where, in the 18th century, there's months where your army is moving, just trying to engage in battles, outmaneuver the enemy, so on and so forth. So for him to be in one spot for 3 months is quite significant, and we'll go into the reasons why a little bit later. But the main reasons, the main kind of features of Dey Mansion is that its location is along the Watchung Mountains. If you've been down to Morristown, to the headquarters there, they love to talk about the Watchung Mountain chain. And Dey Mansion sits next to, once again, Garrett Mountain and those northern mountain chains there. So it's more or less a perch where the army could observe New York City. And we're still in a point in time when Washington is focused on New York City. So if we look at this map here, you see, once again, I hope my cursor is coming through, but you see, right, this fish hook here, this mountain chain of the Watchungs. This right here is Garrett Mountain, right next to the Great Falls and Patterson. And this blue star is more or less where Theunis's house is, or the Dey Mansion. I'll introduce Theunis later. But this is more or less where Washington will be headquartered for the months of July, October, and November. Now, I noticed someone in the chat before we started mentioned that they're from, or they live near Rifle Camp Park. Rifle Camp Park is part of this mountain chain here. It is where some of the Continental Rifles are stationed, once again, keeping eyes out at New York City, which is further to the east of this map, or to what would be the right of the map, right? We have Fort Lee, we have probably Jersey City a little bit down to the south, Hoboken, and then you can see the edge of the Hudson River there. So you really get this idea that, this area between the Watchung Mountain here and the Hudson River, this is all more or less no man's land, especially this area where Patterson, Passaic is, and then all the other suburbs that are attached to it. Now, for the Army, once again, just to add setting to all this, we'll touch again on this later. The Army is encamped along what is more or less a 10-mile chain. Around here at the forks of the Pequannock, just a little southwest of Theunis's, or the Dey Mansion here. This is where the Army will more or less start to be set up. They're also in kind of like the northern Montclair area where Montclair State University is. Valley Road, if you're familiar with the area. And the Army will hook and more or less shadow the Passaic River all the way through what is modern day Totowa, and ends up along Waggerall Brook, which is modern day Hawthorne, which then goes into Bergen County. So this entire space here is roughly around 10 miles long. The Continental Army, when Washington is here, is somewhere between 10 to 15,000 men, depending on which historians you speak to. So quite a significant area, quite a significant place to be spread out across. But the reason why I also want to show you this map is because you can see that this is a developed, settled area. There's a lot of farms up here, which is also going to play into why Washington comes up here. But we'll get into that a little bit later. So coming back to the Dey family, it's a typical yet unique family for the time period. Typical in the sense that they are farmers in this region, much like other people living out here in what used to be Bergen County. There's a large family. This family is, I think, around 12 members in total size at this time. Their ancestry is Dutch. Most of the people living out here are Dutch with their ancestry, coming to the New World in the mid-17th century, when this was all a massive Dutch colony before the English take over. However, the Deys are wealthy. They're wealthier than others. They own 600 acres of land. This is based on some preliminary research. Most areas, or most farmsteads in this area, land grants, families will typically have anywhere between like 50 to 150 acres. The Dey family has 600. So kind of let that sink in. Family is very active in politics, which we'll kind of get into later. And they build for themselves a very large 2-story manor home. The term mansion didn't exist back then, so that's a little 19th century marketing for you. But as you can see here, if you haven't been to the Dey Mansion, this is the primary structure. It's your typical Georgian architectural style, 2 floors with even distribution on both sides, right? You have the 2 windows with rooms right on each side. Center to the house are 2 main hallways, so one on the 1st and 2nd floor. But what's unique about this home is that there's a lot of kind of Dutch influences on it. If you are able to see, if your screen is large enough, you should be able to see this kind of brownstone here, how it interlocks. It's a Flemish design. So when the family builds this home, they're still kind of harkening back to those kind of Dutch cultural roots. With that also said, this family is also, anglicized at this point in time, hence the Georgian architecture or the design of the house. Now, typical homes in the area will look like this. This is your usual farming working class Dutch family in the mid-18th century. This is the Van Houten House in Totua. It's about a mile east of the Dey Mansion here. And this is your typical Dutch vernacular. All right, so about 1.5 stories, 2 stories. Rooms on either side, usually cut in half. This particular building here has an addition that was built on shortly after its construction. And this shows, this would have been like a built-on kitchen to it. And then for a little bit more variety, this would be another type of Dutch home, right? Once again, about 1.5 floors with kind of separated into 2 separate rooms, right? One room would be your kitchen, the other one would be your bedroom. This particular building is located on the property of the Dey Mansion. We call it the summer kitchen. It used to be called the plantation house. But this structure is not original to the site. It was brought here after a number of other historic structures were demolished. It was built here, or the pieces brought here and then reconstructed in the 1970s. And the design they stole from the Doremus house in Montville. So same sort of Dutch idea, 2 rooms and then like half of the 2nd floor, which we actually just had renovated in 2021. So last year, feels like a decade ago. So now that we've kind of set the kind of groundworks, this lecture is going to consist of kind of key components as we talk about the experiences of the different people that lived here. We'll be looking at the household of the Dey family, so who's staying in the house that we know of, who we can speculate of, and then a couple other people that often we normally don't consider. We'll focus on Washington himself, why he picks the site, and kind of his background in case anyone needs a refresher. We'll also be talking about his aide-de-camps. Aide-de-camps are secretaries. They are the pen pushers. They're more or less the bureaucrats that make this army function and work. Without them, this thing will quickly fall apart. And then we'll also talk about soldiers and camp followers, something that I enjoy talking about a lot, since military history is a little bit more in my wheelhouse. But anywho, the Dey family. Before I get into who's living in the house, by the time of Washington's arrival, I do want to do a recap of the entire family up to that point, to kind of give you a better idea of where this family comes from. Likewise, on our general tours, we don't talk about this enough, so I think this will be kind of like a unique insight into how the family becomes wealthy, and how they get to their position. And the family more or less starts from this gentleman named Dirk Jansen Seeken Dey of Holland. He was born in 1615. He'll be passes away in 1687, but he's an immigrant from Holland to New Amsterdam, working as a soldier for the Dutch West Indies Company, right? So thinking of the New World, New Jersey, New York, kind of the colonies in this area, this is all one big Dutch colony. This is before the English get here. And Dirk comes here at the age of 25 in 1641, soldiering for this company. He arrives in New Amsterdam, which will eventually be the future New York City. Now, the settlement was relatively small, having only been developed in 1624. And by Dirk's arrival, it didn't even have a church built yet, which should say something about this settlement, right? Like, this is a Protestant kind of Dutch community. The Protestant Dutch have been fighting for their independence in the 1600s and I think late 1500s against the Habsburg Spanish. And part of their reasons for wanting to separate from Habsburg rule was religion. So not having a church is like, wow, this place hasn't fully set up yet. Now, in 1647, after being there for roughly 6 years, Dirk is arrested for insulting a superior officer on Heeren Street, and he's sentenced to be shot, sentenced to be executed. Now, he would be pardoned and later given a house and land to subsist off of, officially becoming a burgher of New Amsterdam, a citizen with voting rights and all the guarantees and rights that come with that. And his home can be found on the census of New Amsterdam in 1660. So it's kind of unique. I would love to learn more about his history. You know, he kind of comes off as like a rogue, right? This soldier, he insults an officer, and then he gets off on it and gets to build the foundations, which will later become this very wealthy family. So this is the 1660 Castello map, showcasing what New Amsterdam or New York City would have looked like at the time. So for context here, where this fort is and this boulevard that goes up, this is Herenstrasse or Heron Street. I want to say Strasse. That is more or less Broadway. And if we take a closer look, section block B, house number 5 on Die Hera Street or Strasse or Street would be the house that Dirk would be given. So he has this little house here, house number 5 on this block, is within the walls of the city, and then everything outside of it would be farmland or smaller communities. So kind of fairly interesting view of New York City before we colonized it further. Now, the next of kin, Dirk would pass away, and his next of kin, his son Theunis Dey, was Dirk's son, and he only lived 3 years after his father. He too was born in Holland, and we don't really know what conditions brought him to America. He might have come with his father or afterwards, but he certainly inherited from him. And he would end up owning 5.5 acres of land from Broadway to the Hudson River of all farmland. I can only imagine how much 5.5 acres of land in Manhattan is worth today. But if you're familiar with northern New Jersey, you'll be familiar with this name Ryerson. He marries into that family and has a son named Dirk Theunis Dey. That's where it gets a little confusing. Now, Dirk Theunis Dey would be the first to establish himself in the Preakness Valley, which is where the Dey Mansion currently rests. It is suspected that Dirk spent his early life in Bergen County, which is kind of that northeastern section of New Jersey. There's evidence that he served as an ensign in a company of foot run by a Colonel John Johnston, and he also may have lived in the area as a youngster and was probably attached closely with the Ryerson family, which populated this area along with other Dutch names like the Schuyler's, Colfaxes, De Reemers, Van Dynes, Van Wageners, Van Rippers, etc. Now, on October 9th, 1717, he will purchase 600 acres of wilderness for what is roughly 120 pounds New York money at the time. And he will slowly start converting that into farmland. At age 38, he marries Jane Blanchard, and a year later, they produce a son by the name of Theunis Dey. Now, before we get onto Theunis, Dirk, as he ages, he becomes very affluent, most likely based off the income of the farm and family connections that he has. And he became a member of the General Assembly of New Jersey, representing Bergen County from 1748 to 1753, 1754. So he's very active in New Jersey politics. He's, passing laws, dealing with all sorts of issues that arise. But he'll eventually retire to New York City as he gets older, and he'll pass away there in New York in 1764. So this brings us to 1780, the Dey family at Washington's encampment. At this point, the patriarch of this family is Theunis Dey. He is the owner of the property when Washington arrives and visits. And it's important to note that when Washington visits, he will be bringing around 80 to 100 men to sleep in the Dey Mansion. The Dey house is an 8-room Georgian manor with 2 center hallways, like I mentioned before. Usually when Washington comes to your home, families will often vacate from the premises to give Washington the space that he needs. A lot of homes that Washington goes to, usually wealthier families, that will have other properties available to them. But for one reason or another, the family decides to stay here, which we'll also kind of talk about. Another reason why it's a big deal for Washington's visit is, once again, the length of his visit. Unless it's the winter time, Washington typically doesn't stay at one location for long. He's usually going from location to location. Maybe he'll spend a week at one spot, a night at another, but he spends 3 months here. So we'll talk about why in a little bit. Now, the Deys. As we've established, the Deys are a wealthy landowning family by 1780. The head of the household is Theunis, and by 1780, he's 54 years old. Now, Theunis is a farmer, first and foremost. He and his farmer had constructed that brick home, which I showed at the start, the Dey Mansion itself, in 1772. The front of the house is a brick facade, and then the back and sides are a brownstone mix. And the home is known as Bloomsbury Manor when it was built in 1772. It is a house that Theunis resides with his wife Hester and a few of their children. Now, in addition to being a landowner, he's also a former freeholder, holding the title from 1761 to 1776. 1776 is that important year. His political opinions put him on the side of the Revolutionary War, or the revolutionary side, when war breaks out. So as such, he's advocating for the causes of separation from the crown. He has his sympathies. But with that said, he's also a man of kind of repute. He's a colonel of the Bergen County Militia, so he's active in the military aspect of things, right? Being kind of like one of these free citizens, landowning males. So he will also have a reputation from that. In short, he's more or less a known entity of the area. He has patriot leanings, he's for separation, and as an assemblyman, his name in pedagogy would have put him on a list of known revolutionary leaders of northern New Jersey. This is someone that Washington will know about when he's in New Jersey. Someone that he could rely on and come to for support. Now, unfortunately for Theunis, being someone of such stature, he is 54 years old, which means that might limit his capacity to kind of come out into the foray of our standing American heroes, right, our continental American heroes, the officers that lead the Army, people like Washington, Henry Knox, and Alexander Hamilton, Benedict Arnold, people in their mid-20s to late 40s. Theunis won't live actually too much longer after Washington's stay here, so he is a bit more advanced in years. But at the same time, because of that, he does has his connections here. And his service to Bergen County would be immense throughout the entire war, as Bergen County, once again, is going to be one of these front lines. If you remember that map, where Theunis's house is, and then New York, you have this wide middle section where loyalists and patriot militia are fighting each other, looking for supplies and raiding each other's homes. So he's kind of providing security and doing all that sort of work, helping the cause at a local level. Now, during Washington's stay in 1780, we can assume that Theunis would have been busy with the militia, and he most likely would have been aided by his sons. Now, that's Theunis. Sadly, we don't have an image of Theunis, so I can't really have a picture of what he looked like. Now, the matriarch of the family, she's important in her own right. Her name is Hester. And she was part of the Schuyler family, right? She marries Theunis. And she's also a bit of a revolutionary herself. She has membership with a female political organization called the Ladies of Trenton. And Ladies of Trenton are this kind of group of elite women of New Jersey who are using their strong social and political connections to lobby support for the Continental Army. Should be no secret that the Continental Army is a government institution that's not properly funded or equipped for the task given to them. Now, I'm sadly not an expert on kind of feminine history, women's history, but this organization that she's connected with, the Ladies of Trenton, is the perfect example of a woman's ability to take part in political life in the 18th century. We often think that, this is the age of white male landowners who are saying what they can and can't do. That's obviously not the case, as even Adams's own wife said, don't forget the ladies. Most of the women that are part of this Ladies of Trenton organization have literary skills, they know how to write, they have some knowledge of political happenings and the causes that are going on. And they also have this ability to captivate the male-dominated political society that they're kind of living within. So this should say something about their contributions, right? The people are able to pay attention to what they say and contribute to their cause. One of the major contributions that Hester is able to contribute or able to provide is that in July, when Washington's here, she actually vacates the home. She leaves Theunis here with Washington, and she will head to Trenton. And during the month of July, she will be fundraising for the troops, which is also mind-boggling, right? 1780, we're 5 years into this war. We're in a war against the economic power that connects us to our prosperity, right? All of colonial economics and industry was tied to England, and we're 5 years into the war where all that's been cut off. So I can't imagine many people have too much to give. Yet her and her compatriots are able to raise enough funds to acquire 10,000 pairs of socks for the Continental troops. Of all things they purchase, they get socks, which also should highlight the despair that Continental troops are in, that we'll talk about a little bit later. But once again, this is no insignificant thing. Now, the image that we have on here, sadly, we don't have an image of Hester either, but this is her grandchild named Jane, who sadly will not have been born at this time. She'd be born a couple of years after Washington's stay at the house. But we have a portrait of her, or a painting of her here, and then her image or a picture of her surrounded by her daughters there, which is a common piece of art that we have exhibited at the Dey Mansion. Now, there's also children staying at the house. We can't say for certain who was or wasn't at the home. Among other members staying at the family, we think there was one of the youngest sons staying here with his wife and 2 or 3 grandchildren. So right now we're looking at Theunis. We have one of his sons living there. The youngest child at the time was like 16, a daughter-in-law, and then let's say like 2, 3 grandchildren. So 5, 6 Deys staying in this home. One of those grandchildren was Anthony Dey, who is portrayed here in this image. He would have been about 3 years old at the time when Washington stayed there. And as a toddler, I'm sure he has no memories of the encampment. But in later life, he'd become a lawyer and philanthropist, and he helped found Jersey, or the modern Jersey City. Imagine a toddler at home with Washington, right? As business is bustling, and then you have a toddler crawling around. It would have been something else. There is one family member, however, we know wasn't at the home, and that was Jane Van Buskirk. She's the eldest daughter of the Deys. And Jane was married into the Van Buskirk family, who, by all accounts, were very close friends to the Dey family. They themselves were also one of these kind of wealthy, affluent Dutch families in the area. Unfortunately, when the war comes about, Jane marries into this family. This family kind of falls into the loyalist camp, and she decides to kind of stay with that family. She doesn't really reconnect with the Deys. Now, the Van Buskirks will raise their own loyalist militia to fight for the crown. And from what I've been able to read, the head of the household, Abraham Van Buskirk, was close friends with Theunis. He was Theunis's second in command. So I'm sure this was kind of a more personal struggle than what we realize here. There's common idea floating around nowadays that the American Revolution is really an American Civil War, especially here in New Jersey, where it's really neighbor against neighbor. Unfortunately, we don't have much information about how this impacts the Dey family relationship. I'm sure they would have kept correspondence to a degree, but we do know that following the end of the war, she follows her husband, the Van Buskirk family, to Shelbourne, Nova Scotia, and she will pass away there in 1789. So she does not reconnect with the Dey family after the war. So it kind of leaves an interesting point to think about, right? Jane's connections to the Loyalists and Dey's connections, and then you also have to think that this is common knowledge that Jane is married into this loyal family. Theunis has this kind of a scandal, if you will, and he is having Washington stay at his home. But once again, this would have been fairly commonplace, and we'll actually talk about this, about one of Washington's aide-de-camps who is more or less the only patriot and of an entire loyalist family, and he's serving with Washington. Now, there's also another component of this that, once again, is sometimes looked over, and that is the slaves of the Dey household. The slaves did have, or the Deys did have slaves, and based on Theunis's will, he passes away in 1787. He references 3 of them in his will. Only one of them he references by name. That name is Phyllis, and he references her as his wench, which could mean that she was a personal house servant to Theunis. But we also expect that the 3 that were a part of this kind of will were also servants to the household. Now, based on the size of the Dey household, we doubt Hester, Theunis's wife, cooked or did any of that sort of manual work in the home. That probably would have been left to, would have been left to one of the slaves of the household to do, probably one that, their entire job was focused on cooking and providing for the family. But sadly, we don't have names or identities for those 2. We also don't really know if the Deys had more slaves that tended to their farm, right? They have a 300-acre farm. Those records have sadly either been lost or we haven't been able to find them yet. Thankfully, we've been working with Hunter Research, which is based out in Trenton, to kind of dig up this history and paint a better picture of what slavery looked like in northern New Jersey. And based off that, I could give a few details about what it would have looked like. So By the late 18th and early 19th century, enslaved peoples of African descent made up roughly 18% of the population of the state, which is rather significant. New Jersey is a slave state at this time. And 86% of all slaves resided in the northeast region of the state. And that population would grow steadily in the early 1800s. Now, based on tax records, slave owners in New Jersey owned more horses and cattle than their non-slave owning counterparts, which hints that slaves were involved in the work of husbandry, working with animals on the farm. Now, bringing this back to the Deys, right? Once again, we don't really know what would have been here, but we do know that the Deys had a number of head of cattle. They would have had merino sheep, hogs, you name it. They would have diversified what they had here. But from the perspective of the Continental Army, soldiers marching through northern New Jersey, seeing slaves out in the fields working with animals would have been a common sight. Most families in this area, specifically like within the couple miles radius of the Dey family, these households would have had probably one slave that tended to the household. We know, like the Totowa house that I mentioned before, the Van Houten house, we know that site had one slave that tended to the household. So it would have been a common sight here. It would have been commonly seen by soldiers. Now, the image above is kind of a good example of kind of what we're talking about and better help visualize it. This image is the Van Bergen Overmantel by John Hayton, and it shows your typical Hudson Valley farmstead, northern New Jersey, southern New York. In this image, you'll notice that there are a few people of African descent on portray here. For instance, there's this one person up here who seems to be working with, and I can't tell if these are hogs or sheep or not, but once again, they're in the activity of working with that. There's another gentleman here in this orange frock with a dog, right? The dog's running around, so I sadly don't know what's in his hand. There's something going on there. And then they're also here with this either small pig or sheep here with another enslaved person working there. And then you have another one over here in the corner, most likely carrying a water bucket. And then kind of this picturesque scene, industry happening, right? People on their wagons carrying produce to and from, and communities walking around. So for the Continental soldiers encamped here, this wasn't like a barren wilderness. This would have been farmland, I wouldn't say densely populated, right? Spread out. But the communities would have known each other, and you would have seen this on your day-to-day. But once again, this image also kind of reinforces the role of husbandry as an industry in northern New Jersey. Now, we'll move on to the Army itself, George Washington, and who's staying here. So we'll move on to kind of like a second part of our lecture. So the military situation. We know that Theunis is living here. We know he's a patriot. The year is 1780. Like I mentioned before, this war has been going on for roughly 5 years, ever since the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. The Americans have seen their lives disrupted in all facets. This is a war that's happening on our soil. It's being fought by our neighbors. New Jersey is the front lines. It gets invaded by the British, right? Like even all the way in Trenton, the Hessians are there. Now, our story specifically for Dey Mansion starts with the winter of 1779 to 1780. It is the harshest winter on record for the 18th century. There are 28 snowstorms that hit the United States, burying the Northeast in snow. Snow accumulations are somewhere between 6 feet or more. At least that's where we're at Morristown, where the Army is resting. So you can imagine in those little log cabin huts, you open the door and then there's 6 feet of snow. I'm sure it would have been awful. The Hudson River itself does freeze over, so do other tributaries. And they freeze over to such a degree that people could carry cannons across the their frozen banks. which is a statement in itself of how desperately cold it is. Now, while the Continental Army is dealing with these hardships in Morristown, the British Army in New York City is faring little better. But once again, they're in a city, they have access to Long Island, and they also have the English Navy, which can ferry supplies over. If we're at a standard tour inside the mansion, I tell you, the British Navy is the 18th century Amazon delivery service. You just put in your order and hopefully you'll get it. Now, at this point in time, the start of 1780, the war is a stalemate. The last major battle that happened was the Battle of Monmouth, and that was in 1778, 2 years ago. COVID happened 2 years ago, so I'm sure that must have felt like a long time. And that battle was a decisive draw. Since then, there's been a lot of posturing, right? Washington's going up and down New Jersey into New York, trying to see if he could get into New York City or not. That the English are more or less sitting there waiting for something to happen or waiting to be prodded to do something. And for the Americans, time is running out. They're running out of money, and Washington is finding it difficult to pay his troops. Likewise, there are supply issues that continuously hamper the army. This army is formed by state regiments, so the states raise troops and then give it to Washington to use, which means that the national government, right, there really isn't one, and it really can't dictate how these troops get supplied or even give them supplies. So a lot of these regiments are dependent on their home state to give them provisions. So you have issues with states not wanting to contribute to that. The British, however, don't necessarily need to worry too much about supply, so much as they have access to ports and trade. However, the war is expanding to a global one. American colonies in revolt is only one theater of this war, and it's not necessarily the most economically important theater of this war. The Sugar Islands in the Caribbean are much more important, much more profitable. And with countries like France, Spain, and the Dutch Netherlands getting involved, this puts those economic resources at risk, so much so that it threatens to collapse the British economy. Likewise, those aren't the only adversaries. Basically, every continental power on Europe or in continental Europe has a bone to pick with England. So, to one degree or another, most kingdoms, principalities are providing some sort of aid or service to the American cause. Even Great Britain's foremost ally, the Kingdom of Prussia, halts other European powers from sending troops to America by putting blockades on roads. They even stopped some Hessians from being sent over to the Americas. So either passively or actively, England is kind of being picked on here. So in order to win, the British come up with a plan to invade the southern states in the hopes that they'll find popular support. In the spring of 1780, Charleston, South Carolina falls, and the Southern Army that was defending it, Continental Army that was there, is no more. So this opens up the entire Southern colonies. Congress understandably wants a quick resolution to the war. Washington's been posturing in New Jersey for 2 years. They want him to act. Never mind the fact that they can't pay the troops anymore. But Washington is once again focused on New York City. He wants to regain that city. His logic is simple. If he thinks he could kick the British out, the war will be over. Washington is aware in early 1780 that the French will be arriving sometime in the summer, and he thinks that together they will have enough force to be able to do that. So he's kind of putting all of his eggs in one basket for this. So that begs the question, what's happening in July, October, November of 1780? So like I mentioned, the French are expected to arrive in July, which brings us to Dey Mansion. Like I mentioned, it serves as a perch for the Continentals to look out into New York from, and it's a good halfway point between Morristown, where Washington has been encamping, and New York State, and access to Connecticut and the other colonies should the French land there. Now, for July, Washington hears that when he's at Dey Mansion, he hears that the French arrival has happened. and he will leave at the end of the month to meet with the French. He also thinks that perhaps he could sneakily kind of move into New York and recapture the city as the British fleet has left. But unfortunately for him, the fleet comes back and he abandons that plan. So he meets with the French instead. Fast forward to October, the context of his stay is a little different. Here he's dealing with the fallout of the Benedict Arnold betrayal and the hanging of British Major John Andre, which kind of demoralizes his officer corps. And he's even suspecting attack on his quarters at Dey Mansion or at West Point. Fears will eventually subside at the end of the month, and at November he's planning an attack on Staten Island, which never materializes. And it's probably a good thing it didn't. So George Washington, who is he? He's a born planter, he's born to a planter family in Virginia. He spends his early years as a land speculator and survey and landowner. 1752, at the age of 20, he begins his military career as a major in the Virginia militia. And at the age of 21, he starts a world war, the French and Indian War, by attacking a French garrison. Now, although the war would be won, Washington's part in it is often met with disaster. Really, his only notable success is working with the Virginia militia. Most state militias during the war are anywhere between like 300, 400 or 500 men, and the levels of that will vary. Washington will grow his militia to 1,000 men and will repel numerous Native American incursions into Virginian territory. He does obviously press for a commission as a British field officer, but he gets denied, which some historians argue is kind of what put the nail on the hammer for the British Empire in the United States. Now, after the war, he does enter politics and becomes an opponent to British taxation efforts. And in 1775, as we know, he's nominated as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. So 5 years later, all this brings him to Dey Mansion. During his time here, Washington will be writing over 300 pieces of correspondence. So in those 3 months, he's going to be at his desk writing all these orders and sending all these things out. And he will receive over 1,200 pieces of correspondence as well. So intelligence reports, items from his spy chain in Manhattan, so on and so forth. So that's what he's primarily doing here, is more or less organizing and maintaining the army. There's also other people staying at Dey Mansion, specifically the aide-de-camps, Alexander Hamilton, James McHenry, Tench Tillman, Robert Hanson Harrison, Richard Kidder Meade, and David Humphreys. I'm sure out of all those names, everyone only recognizes Alexander Hamilton's, which is understandable. And then Washington's lifeguard will also be here. Lifeguard comprise around 60 to 80 of that 100 people that Washington brings to the house. And they will be staying in the attic for the months of July, October, and November. I will quickly go over each and every one of these characters, the aide-de-camps, because I think they kind of all come from unique and different backgrounds and share their own kind of unique, different experiences. So we'll start with the most famous of them, Alexander Hamilton. Now, Hamilton is the youngest of Washington's of his aides. He's either 23 or 25 years old. Historians don't know when he was born. But he had been an aide for a while with Washington. He began his service as an aide-de-camp in 1777. And by the time we get to Washington's encampment at Dey Mansion in 1780, 3 years has gone by. And Hamilton is really hoping to go back into the field, right? He wants a field command. And the position of aide-de-camp is really meant to help young officers get some staff training, learn kind of like the logistics of maintaining the army and dealing with all the bureaucratic workings of it. And then they'd be resent back out. Usually a couple months to a year is what you look at. But for Alexander Hamilton, right, this is his 3rd year. So he's really itching to get back into the action. However, Washington finds him too reliable and doesn't want to let him go. Now, at the end of November, he will let him go marry his sweetheart, Elizabeth Schuyler. And while he's at Dey Mansion, he is writing love letters to her, one of which he does write asking if she still loves him or not, because he doesn't get any word from her. But upon his return in early 1781, after Washington has left Dey Mansion, him and Washington will have a small argument, which then leads Hamilton to being dismissed and allowing to take on field command. This is an image of him at Yorktown in the parapets. Now, another unique individual is James McHenry. He's an Irish doctor. He was born in, I forget the county that he was born in Ireland, but he moves to the New World. He's been in aide-de-camp since 1778. Now, in August, James McHenry is only here for the month of July. He will transfer out in August to be with Lafayette. But he came into Washington's service after being a POW to the British. He's captured following the fall of New York City. And as a captive, he tends to wounded American troops. And he's often petitioning British leadership to give him more supplies to help his men out. He even comes across a gentleman who's actively trying to murder wounded Continental troops by giving them like the wrong services and withholding supplies to them. So he gets into a bit of a row with Clinton about that. And he'll also be allowed to speak with Washington, informing Washington of the condition of prisoners of war. Now he is allowed to go back. He's kind of transferred in a prisoner exchange in 1778, and he'll go to Washington directly, and he will be brought on part of his staff. There's one key feature about most of Washington's aide-de-camps is that they all suffer from different illnesses. So some historians, particularly Arthur Lefkowitz, who wrote an entire book about all the different aide-de-camps, suspects that James McHenry is really brought on to tend to everyone's problems and to provide those services. After the war, he will he would be elected to the Maryland Senate. Now, our next gentleman, number 3, is Tench Tillman. He's from an affluent Maryland family who are staunch loyalists. Tench himself is a dedicated patriot. He signs a non-importation agreement, which hurts his business in the early years of kind of that rebellious fermentation that's happening in the colonies. And upon the outbreak of war, he will join the Pennsylvania militia, and soon he gets assigned to the Continental Army. Now, possibly due to family connections, Washington will learn about him and make him his aide-de-camp in August of 1776. Tench Tillman would eventually become Washington's longest serving aide-de-camp. Now, his service to his new country was conflict for his family. They were loyalists. A number of them go under house arrest in the conflict. He has a brother serving in the British Navy and another brother serving in India with the East India Company. And in letters between his family, the topic of Tench Tillman's allegiance often comes up and is a point of tension. So if you ever have time to read up on that, I highly recommend it. A year after staying at Dey Mansion, he would deliver news of Cornwallis' surrender to Congress in 1781. So it's kind of fairly interesting on his part to deliver that news. But sadly, and this is one of the cases of someone dealing with illness as an aide-de-camp, he would not live long after the war's end, passing away in 1786. The 4th aide-de-camp that is here is Washington's lawyer, Robert Hanson Harrison. He's the 2nd longest serving aide-de-camp, and he meets Washington, being the lawyer before the war. Meets him in Alexandria, Virginia, helps Washington on a number of legal works regarding land purchases, but he's asked to assist Washington early 1775. Washington knows he needs a man of letters and papers to assist him. So for 5 years, Robert Hanson Harrison is with Washington, kind of serving with him and dealing with all the paperwork that happens. However, he will leave in October. So when Washington returns, Harrison will leave us, and he would take a leave of absence. He would come back in 1781, but ultimately resigns due to his financial state. He is absolutely broke. His father passes away. He has 2 children, which they have no guardian. And he's also offered a job with the courts of Maryland. So, he's looking for steady income. Now, he almost becomes an associate justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. He's nominated by Washington himself, but he turns it down due to his failing health, and he will die shortly after. Now, another one I've actually been writing about today is Richard Kidder Meade. He's a man who almost captured General Clinton at the Battle of Monmouth. He serves as aide-de-camp for about 3.5 years, starting in 1777 and also ending in October of 1780. So once again, with Hanson, he will leave to go back to Virginia. He has a number of reasons. He's getting married. However, Meade would not rejoin with Washington due to Benedict Arnold, now with the British Army, engaging Virginia, invading Virginia and burning down a number of settlements. So he'll be working with the defense of that. Now, Richard Kidder Meade lives until 1805. He passes away due to complications with gout and, quote, illnesses attributed to his hardships in the military. So, we don't have too much information on him. He does become a really wealthy landowner in Western Virginia after the war, and kind of keeping in the theme of the idea of the American Revolution being a civil war. His son will vouch for the Confederacy, and his grandson will fight and die in the as part of Robert E. Lee's army during the Civil War. Now, the last one is David Humphreys. In terms of Washington's staff, he is the newest member, having been appointed on June 23rd, 1780. So like a week or two before Washington comes here, David Humphreys is brought on. With that said, David Humphreys is not new to the role of aide-de-camp. He's been an aide-de-camp with General Putnam and later Nathaniel Greene. Washington will actually steal Humphreys from Greene to use for his services here. Now, he'd write many patriotic manuscripts and poems. He kind of revels in the achievements of the Americans, often highlighting them. And he earns unique praise from Washington. The two of them would soon become very, very close friends. Now, after the war, he is unemployed, but he'll ask Washington for any sort of job, and he would later serve as a diplomat to Spain and also deals with the Barbary pirates for a while. Now, in addition to these kind of American officers, right, these up-and-comers, there's also a number of guests that come to the house. One of these guests that I do want to spend some time on, I'll probably only spend time on this one because I know we're getting a little on time, is the Marquis de Chastellux. Now, the reason why I want to talk about him is because it correlates with our site and the developments that we're doing here. About a year or two ago, I can't remember because what is a year or two ago, the Dey Mansion received a grant from the National Park Service to redevelop and upgrade our visitor center. And part of that is to highlight our connection to the French. Now, in July, Washington hears that the French arrived at Newport, Rhode Island. So we are kind of the starting point for Washington's relationship with Rochambeau. So we're going to be attached to the Washington-Rochambeau Trail. Our visitor center, which I'm currently sitting in, is going to be remodeled and renovated fairly soon. So when we reopen, you'll see kind of new displays and professional exhibits put in place. Now, the Marquis de Chastellux doesn't meet Washington until November. I mentioned that Washington will leave at the end of July, move up to meet with Rochambeau over August. But for one reason or another, Chastellux is not there. Now, in October, Chastellux really wants to meet Washington. He really wants to find some sort of excuse to go out there and kind of venture the American colonies, get a lay of the land. So he passes the idea to the Marquis de Rochambeau, and he asks him like, "Hey, we're going to need maps. Let me kind of map out the area between us and Philadelphia, so that when our army moves in the upcoming campaign season, we'll have updated maps and we'll be able to navigate the kind of wilderness of these colonies." Rochambeau agrees and lets him go. Now, Chastellux Apart from being a kind of an established military figure, he served in the 7 Years' War in Europe. He has a reputation by himself. He's also an enlightened thinker with a number of published works. And as he leaves to map out the colonies, he's keeping a journal with him. And he more or less makes a beeline for where Washington's headquarters is here in Wayne. So he travels through, and he's making his way here. Eventually, he enters northern New Jersey. He comes across a couple patriots. They mention that he shouldn't go near the Hudson River because there's loyalists there. He should instead go more into the interior of New Jersey. So coming back to this map, he will come in, instead of coming in where like Newbridge is, he'll come in along the Ramapo, hook a right at Pond's Church, and then on his way to Dey Mansion, literally run into the entire Continental Army. His idea is that he wants to stop by Lafayette's headquarters first so that Lafayette can make the connection to Washington, right, introduce him. But sadly for Choiseul, Lafayette is already at Dey Mansion. So he makes this long trip, this 5-mile trip down from Hawthorne down to Dey Mansion. Now, upon arriving, he sees all the tents in front of the Dey Mansion. He sees Washington's standard flying in the wind. Washington's flag was a blue flag with 13 white stars. And he sees two gentlemen talking at the front of the steps of Dey Mansion, one of which is very tall, and the other one is the Marquis de Lafayette. So he approaches, introduces himself, and Lafayette makes the connection there for him. Over the next few days, the Marquis will spend most of his time with Washington. They'll go review the troops during a really muddy day. Choiseul writes about it, saying it's pouring out, and he's trying to review the troops, and he sees all these Continental troops in their blue uniforms. They're all standing, and they all look immaculate, which probably hints that Washington is putting his properly dressed troops on display for the French. But unfortunately, they have to call it quits because it's raining and they can't do all the drill. But the two of them will talk late into the evening. They'll share stories over Madeira wines and roasted nuts, and all of this Choiseul writes down. After the war, Choiseul will publish his stories and travels of the Americas, and sadly, we get a lot of information from this book, but he doesn't include a lot of information as well. He mentions that he doesn't want to betray Washington's confidence. So sadly, we lose out a lot on the context of those conversations. But we could only imagine what that was like. Now, Choiseul will leave when Washington leaves, and he'll make his way down to Philadelphia, kind of completing his original goal of mapping out the area. Now, this kind of brings us next to the rest of who's staying here. We've talked a lot about the officers, right? We've talked about Washington. We've talked about Alexander Hamilton, Tench Tillman, Henry Harrison, all these people who came from a position of wealth, or at least were up and coming in terms of their wealth. These people came from backgrounds of education. They are people who are able to afford to go without pay. They're able to purchase numerous uniforms for themselves for all these separate dining occasions and different meetings that they have to go to, right? If you're in Washington staff, you should have a clean uniform when you go to dinner. So it's very expensive to be an officer. This is not true for the regular Continental soldier. The regular Continental soldier is most likely going to be like your middle or comprised of middle or lower class peoples. At the start of the war, it's a little different. Start of the war, you have a lot of idealists who want to fight in this. They bring their own stuff, their spirits are up. But war isn't a fun time, and a lot of these guys will eventually go back home, right, when their enlistments are up. This is a constant problem for Washington. So 5 years into this war, by 1780, the enlisted soldier is someone who knows what this is about. They're trained and disciplined, and this is probably either they're super idealistic, and they can withstand kind of the degradations of living as a soldier in the 18th century, or this is just a good source of income. Many Continental soldiers, especially the lower enlisted, may not have a trade. So this may be the only way that they could secure some sort of experience doing work. You also have to think, right, the colonies are in a recession. This is not a good time economically for America. Others may have joined for adventure, right? There's always going to be a few of those soldiers of fortune types. Some might have believed in the cause. Some see it as a means to elevate their position in life, right? Soldiering is seen as an honorable trade in the 18th century. It can be a place where you gain reputation and are able to move up the social ladder a little bit. But ultimately, these guys know what they're fighting for. This wasn't the Army of 1775. It's not the Army of 1776. This is a disciplined fighting force. And they are here with full understanding of that. Now, with that said, some of the things that they deal with are lack of equipment, kind of like I hinted at before. In 1778, due to this ongoing conflict, right, England is our industry. You're kind of the producers of raw resources. Everything is supposed to be manufactured in England. So with that said, there is going to be a clothing shortage in the colonies. So clothing will be used as a recruitment tool. America at this point is having French uniforms come in. We'll dye them and make them how we need them to. So when these states are trying to fill their enlistment quotas, they'll use clothing as a means to enlist, right? Enlist and become a Continental soldier. You'll be paid X amount of money. We'll give you land at the end of it, and we'll also give you clothing. You'll look like a gentleman. So when you enlist, you get all these nice things. But as time goes on, let's say your nice new shoes start getting holes in them. And part of your enlistment, it's promised that every year you'll get 2 pairs of everything, right? 2 pairs of jackets, shirts, 2 pairs of shoes. But this doesn't hold up. This is why often a lot of portraits and a lot of paintings, you'll see soldiers wearing rags, because once again, when you enlist in the Army, you're enlisting in the state's regiment, right? The states are raising these forces. It's not the national government, right? It's not Continental Congress, it's the states. So the states will provide this for you. So if you're from North Carolina, you're all the way up here in New Jersey, do you think you're getting that shipment of clothing and equipment to you? It's probably not coming. So requisition of basic necessities is going to be very difficult. You might think, oh, well, all these states are fighting for a common cause. Maybe New Jersey will hand out jackets and shoes and everything for everyone. New Jersey probably won't do that. They're saving it for themselves, for their own militias and their own regiments, which oddly enough are in New York and elsewhere. So in terms of that, it's logistically, the 18th century Army life is a nightmare. Now, living conditions will obviously vary. Comparing again with officers, all the people that we talked about prior, right? Tench Tillman, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, these people will get to sleep in houses. This image here, you see our reenactors at Dey Mansion on their grounds. They have tents set up. You'd be lucky sometimes to have a tent. A lot of cases, soldiers might be sleeping out under the stars. They might be forced to put together brush huts, especially if the Army's on the move. You might not have time to get the tents to where they need to be in time. And tents are heavy, right? Like guys might not want to hold there and carry them. The same also goes for cooking equipment. You can see at the base of the image there's a Dutch oven, some cooking items. Those are heavy. Those are made out of iron. Soldiers may throw them to the side of the road and make do with something else. So there's also that sense of like, I don't want to call it sabotage, right? But young men are going to pick and choose what they want to carry. So they might lose a couple items on their way to and from places, which is going to add to the deprivations that these soldiers have to deal with. Food obviously is another issue. Soldiers are supposed to get 1 pound of bread, half a pound of beef or pork, and 1 pound equivalent of cup of rice, malt beer, cup of peas, beans equivalent, vinegar and soap. This is also hard to come by. One of the major reasons Washington comes up to Dey Mansion is because we have a lot of farmland around here, a lot of patriots in this area who are willing to support the army, and Washington knows he can't stay at Morristown forever. He's been living off the land there. The land needs to recover. The people who live there need to recover. So he'll come up here, and there are records of nearby people living in the area selling produce, different animals, even firewood to the army itself. And the army is giving out IOUs to be rewarded much later. So you have those things going on. To make matters worse, this is the 18th century. Our knowledge of germs and proper cooking etiquette is not always at the foremost of our minds. So you also have issues with troops trying to cook their meats, right? They might try to grill them by the fire. While the outside of a meat might look grilled and ready to go, the inside is still raw. So Washington will force the troops to try and boil their meats in order to make sure the soldiers don't get sick. So you have those issues. You have the health issues as well. Washington has the army inoculated for smallpox. So there's that. So really, when it comes to food, the troops are eating whatever is available to them. I've even seen images of soldiers holding up like a mixture of beans and flour, and it kind of congeals into this like grayish, sludgy stew. It's really disgusting. But once again, that's a hardship that these guys have to face. Meanwhile, the officers staying at the home, right, they're getting their nicely cooked meals. Even Washington's own dinners at the Dey Mansion, he might have a 13-course dinner as he both meets and entertains a number of his officers throughout his evening meals. And last, but certainly not least, are the camp followers, the women and children of the army. Now, it's important to note that 18th century armies are nothing like the armies of today. Armies today are very mechanized. They have proper logistics systems. Today we have factories that create meals that all you need is a little water, and there's a heater that cooks a meal for you, and there you go. Armies are more or less self-sufficient. 18th century armies are not self-sufficient. They need all the help they can get, especially in the continental Europe. When an army moves, it's like a city moving, right? You have camp followers, you have all these people following loved ones. They might be following the army for economic reasons, right? Maybe they're bartering and trading. They might be a sutler, or they might just be looking to earn. Maybe they're just idealistically they want to help out. So for the Continental Army, a part of this army is women and children. Women will obviously provide a number of services like chopping firewood, cooking food, cleaning clothing, providing aid in kind of medical facilities, once again, collecting things to sell, resell. They might even be refugees, people that have had their homes burnt down by loyalist or British raids, people that, once again, may have nowhere to go, or just economically dependent on a significant other. So those are the type of roles that they'll fill. Children will also be part of that. They'll be assisting where they can. Once again, they're probably connected to someone in the army or to mothers or sisters. Children also play important roles, assisting with like drumming, flutes. The musicians of the band typically is a position for them. They might be runners for getting water in the heat of battle. So there is that component as well. Washington typically does not like these people for a whole variety of reasons. And the primary reason is that it's more mouths to feed. The more people that you have, the more mouths you have to feed. And Washington's having hard times enough just trying to feed his men. So as he goes from place to place, he's often trying to offload these people in local communities. But still, the army cannot function without them, because they provide so many tasks, and sometimes soldiers will pay them to do things that the soldiers don't want to do. I know, like, I would rather have someone else do laundry or do my cooking or whatever. So, you know, you have that going on as well. Little young man laziness. So with that said, you have a lot of these different perspectives happening that kind of comprise this force that is staying in and around Dey Mansion. So with that brings us to our conclusion. The Dey Mansion and surrounding property, like many headquarters locations, were places where a large, diverse group of people cohabited together, each with their own diverse and unique experiences with a plethora of reasons that brought them there. And I hope that this talk, this lecture, kind of is eye-opening for some. I know there's a number of primary accounts that go into much more detail that review kind of the hardships that are experienced. So if anything, I hope, you know, if this is new, this will inspire you to kind of dig deeper and check out your local historic sites and see what they have as well.
Thank you very much, Kelly. What a tremendous amount of information. And as a person who grew up on the West Coast, the detail that you were able to provide is just incredible in terms of what the experience was of all these different people who were connected with just this 3 months of stay at the Dey Mansion. If folks have questions or comments, feel free to either unmute yourself or put something in the chat. Oh, I see somebody is that we've got a couple of great of comments about how wonderful the presentation was. And we have recorded it so that we'll be able to share it with others. I did have a couple of things, really comments more than anything. So first of all, the fact that the Dey Mansion was called Bloomsbury is connected us, you know, to Trenton and to Trent's house, which by the time of the Revolution was first owned by a person that we sort of think was loyalist, but we're not so sure, Dr. William Bryant. And he called his house at that time was called Kingsbury. He was had been pensioned off from the British Army as a surgeon. So that's why there was some sense that he was loyalist, but we're not so sure. Larry Kidder, a local, you know, someone who's written a lot on the Revolutionary War, told us that he's kind of suspicious that he might be just somebody who was trying to get by. And that, you know, very much like you were saying, Kelly, about, you know, the impact of war on everyday people. How do you get by and when you've got war going on all around you? But he sells his house, Bryant does, to Colonel John Cox, who's the Deputy Quartermaster General in the Continental Army. And of course, then we're not going to keep that name Kingsbury anymore. So it becomes Bloomsbury. So I was very interested to hear that that the Dey Mansion was also called Bloomsbury. The other thing that's interesting, and I encourage people to keep posted to us at the Trent House, because you mentioned Marquis de Châteauroux, and there's a woman, she's actually Dutch, I think, Dr. Iris de Rode, who has just finished, recently finished her doctorate at the University of Paris. Somehow she got access to some of the private papers that had not been published by the Marquis. Wow. And has, you know, and has been, that was her dissertation. And she's been giving talks about what she's learning about his reflections on the Revolutionary War and the places and so on. So she's actually going to give a talk for us on July 10th.
Oh, I'll have to watch that.
Yeah, and she is a very interesting person and has, you know, I don't know how she got into the and maybe she'll tell us that, how she managed to get into those private papers, but it's and I had not heard of him before. You know, you hear of Lafayette, you hear of Rochambeau, but I had not heard of him, but apparently he played a great role in documenting the Revolutionary War and And people think of him as maybe one of the first historians of the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, he also has like a really close relationship with Washington too. After the war concludes, the two of them are obviously writing each other, and at some point Washington finds out that he's been married, and he's like, "Oh, you've been caught or catched," you know. So it's kind of like I wonder like what that conversation was like.
Yeah, yeah.
So.
Anyone want to have a comment or a question? There's so much information. As I said, we're going to have the recording available soon. Feel free to unmute yourself. Go ahead, Donna.
Okay, it's Judy, Donna and I are watching together. But we live in Dayton, just outside of Princeton, but there's a Dey road that goes from Cranberry to Princeton. And I always wondered, I'm happy to know how to pronounce it now, but wondered if that was connected to the Dey family.
That's a great question, and I wish I can answer it with like full certainty. But I'll give you kind of a background history instead of kind of what happens to the Dey family. After 1801, so Theunis passes away in like 86, 87. His eldest son, Richard, which is the anglicized version of Dirk, takes over the farm operations. And the property in traditional European fashion of succession gets subdivided between the sons, and they all sell. By 1801, Richard sells the plot after coming into debt. And the family kind of spreads out and vacates throughout the Americas, more or less. Like a number of them go to New York, a couple of them head down south to New Jersey, or southern parts of New Jersey. With that said, though, since I don't really know, I have looked up pension records and like other records of enlistments for militias and Continental Army troops in New Jersey, and I have seen the name Dey pop up in like that central southern section in New Jersey.
That's where we are.
Yeah, I sadly don't know if those Deys are related or not. And that's kind of like the unfortunate bit of like our genealogy, is that we're just following like this one line that goes to Theunis. I sadly can't say if that area.
Curious about it. Yeah. But it was a great presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.